why did I do this work? So I'm really interested in indigenous history, and for those of you who are not familiar with what's indigenous, the term in Hindi probably would be Adivasi. I chose caciques because these are indigenous leaders. Now, a lot of you may know that the word cacique, the term, it was applied all across Latin America. The term curaca was also applied in the Andean region, but caciques are these indigenous leaders who the term used by the Spanish who came in. And these are sort of liminal figures, always between two worlds, because caciques are representatives of indigenous communities, but they're also what glues the indigenous world to the non-indigenous. Oftentimes, caciques are brokers for the non-indigenous government, and so they're embedded in two worlds all the time, in the indigenous world and in the non-indigenous world. And so looking at them as figures whose life stories I can talk about allows me to talk about this relationship between indigenous, non-indigenous world, government, and community, and all of those things. So for me, caciques became those figures, those life stories I could really archive and look at. I chose Yucatan. You all know that, and I'll talk about in a minute, that Mayans were obviously not just in Yucatan, but in Guatemala, in Belize, Honduras, and other places. So there are a couple of personal reasons for choosing Yucatan. One is that the archive is really well maintained, and as any historian will tell you, that's a very important thing, because a well-maintained archive can really take off years from your research, and it's a really, the archive is just a pleasure to work in. Another thing, my supervisor was an anthropologist working in Yucatan, and his work was really inspirational to me. There's also, just as, and I think many of you may have seen the exhibit going on for Guatemala. Similar to Guatemala, Yucatan also has a very long-standing indigenous communities. Even now, if you go to Yucatan, if you go to Mérida, the city, you see women wearing the traditional ipil, which is traditional Mayan clothes. And a lot of times when you have festivals, you still have, cook things in pibil, which is you take the meat and you bury it under the soil and you cook it. And so a lot of those same things, traditions, continue. And that's one of the reasons that Mayans are such interesting culture to look at, because they're so vital. And they're still, they're just everywhere, and it's not just about looking at indigenous people as if they're relegated in the past. They're really a part of our present, and so for me this was a real reason. And also Yucatan is really different from the elsewhere in Mexico, and a lot of people think of Yucatan as really a world of art. And I really wanted to work in this period. So before I begin, I'm just going to contextualize things a little bit. Even though my own work is on the 19th century, some of these things are important context to think about. So if you look here, these are the Mayan lowlands, that's Yucatan, Guatemala, these are the Mayan highlands. Now, one of the really interesting things about the Mayan civilization is that it had this huge spread, but unlike the Aztec, which is the other Mesoamerican civilization, which is something that we all know about, the Mayans did not have this one pyramidal structure with one head. Mayans were city-states, right? So you have, for instance, in the 12th century, you have something called Mayapan, where this is one of the mythic arrangement where a city is made, where a lot of different nobles from different lineages, they're called the Chival, they're brought together. And what happens, obviously, is that because there was no central authority figure, it was actually quite difficult for the Spanish to really ever conquer Mayans in the same way that they were able to conquer either the Aztecs in Mesoamerica or the other great indigenous civilization, which is the Incas in Peru and the Andean region. So it actually, even though you may think that not having a very straight structure is problematic, actually for Mayans it worked out quite well, because they were able to survive with a lot of their culture intact, because if you don't have a head you can just cut and replace, it becomes much more difficult to conquer that area. So in the pre-conquest period, Mayan communities or was the basic unit of society. So, and the cap would compose of, a particular plot of land, it's the inhabitants. In this caste, there are many castes, and each caste had its own headman or a bata. And this I linked to later how this becomes quite important. But this is the pre-conquest, sort of, just to give you a brief glance of what pre-conquest period looked like. Okay, so just to go back a little bit away from Yucatan for a minute, and again I'm trying to contextualize this work. We all know that Columbus headed west, and this is kind of probably the kind of map that he might have used, where you didn't really know where the Americas was, and he thought it was coming to Asia, but really came into Hispaniola, the Caribbean. And obviously this is where you get this misnomer from of indigenous people being called Indians, right? Because the conquerors felt that they had come to India. And this name obviously stuck, and it's actually funny enough, we are talking in India, and this is really funny. Anyway, the term India obviously becomes a very pejorative term. So, and I think a lot of historians are really careful about not using the word El Indio. A lot of people prefer to use El Indígena because that's a much more neutral term to use. Indigenous has a lot of connotations of, uncivilized, backward, all of those things which people try to avoid. This is a kind of a painting which gives you a sense of, and I think pictures can tell a lot of very interesting stories. And this is a lot about the justification for conquest. And obviously you can see the cross here for God, gold, and glory. Those were the three things that the Spanish were really coming in to do. But this is also a justification. You can see that the natives are not close, so this idea of kind of backwardness. I don't know if there's something happening in the back there. I don't know if anyone can understand what's happening there, the fire. It's actually indigenous people burning another indigenous and cooking them to eat them. So cannibalism, again, was a justification for conquest, that when the Spanish come in, that they would be able to ameliorate the situation and just make things a lot better for these people who obviously were stuck somewhere in the past where they were practicing all of these things. So this is also another thing, of course, is the gold that this person is wearing. And again, I have to say why this is interesting in terms of Yucatan. But gold was another one of those things that really drove conquerors to come into this area. Now, Yucatan is really different. One of the things is that there was no gold. And actually, there was no resource that Spaniards could get there. Yucatan, if you see the peninsula, it's a limestone belt. And not a lot of things grow there. And so it was one of the principles was for the Spanish to come in and really find something to there. But the other thing that was interesting about Yucatan, and I think the conquest of Mayans in general, whether it's in other places too, in Guatemala and others, which is that it was not a single event. It was a very protracted affair, and it was in several stages. So there are stages, for instance, in the very beginning, where you have Spanish-Maya encounters all along the coast, and there are certain Mayans who became quite famous. Gonzalo Guerrero was one Mayan who actually turns native. He gets lost, and then he becomes a Mayan himself and tries to defend this place against Spaniards. And unlike the Aztecs, who did in the very beginning think that the Spaniards were somehow divine, Mayans, because they had so much exposure to Spaniards coming in, because it happened all the way from 1502 to 1546 and onwards, there were so many encounters with Spaniards that Mayans never saw them as divinity. They saw them as other people were. And in fact, oftentimes the conquest, which a lot of history books begin with the conquest, and that's partly sort of a very Eurocentric way of looking at the history of a particular area, because for Mayans, a lot of the important things had actually happened even earlier than conquest, which is the fall of places like Mayapan, where this integration of their own culture. And so there are some things that are significantly different about conquest of the Mayan areas. One other thing that obviously is part of this conquest is that it was a violent affair in some ways. And we all know about the Popol Vuh, which is, again, a Guatemalan Mayan text. Talks about the origins of Mayans. And the reason why there's so few Mayan texts, Popol Vuh, Chilambalam would be just a couple that are there, is because in the 1560s, Diego de Landa, who was one of the friars who had come into the Mayan area, was really astoundingly heard about idolatry. The idea was that Mayans had already been somehow conquered and were not practicing the religion anymore. And out of fear, almost all Mayan texts were burnt. And so we may have had hundreds of Mayan texts now available. We only have the Popol Vuh and Chilambalam, really, to talk about this particular period. So it was a bloody affair, and 1542, Tijo, which was an originally Mayan town, was renamed Merida, and this is sort of thought about as the completion of the conquest. And these are the Montejos. There's actually a road in Merida, which is called Paseo de Montejo. These are the people who conquered. But obviously, the conquest was never really ever complete. And a lot of people still say that conquest is still not complete. And that's the whole reason why you have so much cultural vitality of minds, that conquest really never was a completed thing. So moving on to the colonial period. Now this is where actually the things start getting really interesting for me. And so colonial rule, and we know that Yucatan really had no riches. It was very difficult to convince conquerors to come and stay in Yucatan when you could go to places like Peru or Central Mexico where you could really make money. So there was not much incentive for Spanish to stay here. And so colonial rule became predicated on racial difference. So race, differentiating on the basis of race became a way of controlling society. And there was a sistema de castas, which some of you may know about, which was used again for this purpose. In Yucatan, and this is true for other Spanish settlements as well, administratively, the colonial society was divided into two groups, República de Indígenas and República de Españoles. And what this meant is that each community, each town, if you had indigenous people and if you had non-indigenous people would be subject to particular laws, and they would have their own particular chief or head. And the logic of this system was that it eliminated the need for the Spanish to directly govern the indigenous pueblos. And in Yucatan, and this is where our earlier conversation about the pre-conquest period becomes relevant, actually the Spanish didn't really overhaul the system at all. What they did is that there was already the pre-existing Ka, and what they did is that they gave a cabildo. A cabildo is like a council. It's a group of people who act to administer a particular area. So they gave each Ka a cabildo, and the pre-existing Batab we talked about became the cacique. And in fact, the words Batab and cacique are so interchangeable that even when you look at documents, even in the 19th century, people use the terms almost as a translation for each other at this after this point. Now, there were some hereditary caciques, but most of the time it was based on yearly elections. And by 16th century, this format, taking a town and dividing it, and indigenous people being governed by a particular set of people and non-indigenous by their own, is completely entrenched. And by 17th century, you have the system of elections coming in, which is that every year a Batab or a cacique will be elected. Now, another interesting thing, and this is how I think that cultural mingling is so interesting, because you may try to do one thing, but you have a very different effect, which is that there's one historian, his name is Thompson, and he worked on this one town called Tecanto. And what he found is that this cacique, each cacique was being returned for 20 years. Every year the same cacique was returned. And obviously the question was, why 20 years, and why are we seeing this pattern? And obviously the 20 years correspond to the Tun calendar. 20 is the basic unit of the Mayan calendar. And so the Batab, or the cacique now, was still being returned for those 20 years, as if the conquest had never really even happened. So it's very interesting because, and this is, I think, kind of trying to understand why is it that Mayanness is so pervasive? Why is it that we never lost the Mayan culture? It's because it never went away. It was always there, even within colonial society itself. It was co-opted by Spaniards, and it was never ever pushed aside or relegated aside. Now, to be a cacique was also something you had to be wealthy. And there was again a very interesting reason why wealth was important. And this was because caciques were in charge of collecting taxes. So now if you embezzle taxes, which you can when you're collecting them, what's the security? If you are wealthy and you have land, then the government can just seize your land and your wealth in lieu of the money you may or may not have embezzled. And so wealth becomes a very important thing, as does literacy. And caciques become very, very important. So the cabildo, which is the council, cacique with his junior officer, the teniente, and then there's escribano, who's the scribe, and regidores, or kind of aldermen. They had several functions. So they acted as a notary. They would notarize bills of sale, wills, petitions, legal proceedings, death notices. The cabildo also acted as an archive. So it contained all documents pertinent to the society. It administered public utilities, maintained public buildings, organized the postal system, policing, everything that you could think about to maintain a society. The cabildo did, and the cacique in this was particularly important because he was the linchpin of stability. He could maintain that balance between the Maya and the Spanish world so that everything worked in a harmonious way. And this was throughout this period. In addition to the cabildos, the indigenous people also had access to law. And it's actually quite interesting. So the Spanish crown saw indigenous people as minors, as children, because they were thought of as people who needed to be tutored in Christianity and other things, and then become really adults. And so a lot of the laws that were used for orphans in Spain were brought into Latin America. So for instance, in this time period, you had a protector in Spain who would look after orphan children. And when Spaniards come into the Mayan area, they introduced the same idea of protector, because for them, indigenous people were niños con barba, which is, children with beards. So that was the idea, and you had this protector coming in, but it also allowed this new sort of, legal forms to come in, and a tribunal, the indios, to which the protector was answerable to. And so legally now the indigenous people also had access to law, and this is something that indigenous people continued to take advantage of throughout the colonial period, even after, and even now. Law is one of those things that indigenous people continue to use to try to, find some solution to their problems. Now, so this is the colonial period. Late colonial period is another special period, because this is a period of really drastic change beginning to happen. Now, before the late 18th century, you had, this picture of indigenous communities really being left to themselves, being able to have their own laws, their own caciques, all of those things, and really not having much interference in terms of the state. Yes, you had a protector, but that was it. There was nothing else really to hamper the authority of a cacique in the locality. Bourbon reforms changed this. And obviously the idea of the Bourbon reforms was that the Spanish wanted to streamline administration, and also to sort of cut down the power of criollos, the Spanish born in the Americas. And doing these reforms and streamlining things, what they started to do for the first time is introduce officials, government officials, into the regions, into the localities. And the subdelegado was this one official that was introduced. And suddenly the cacique was no longer the single authority. The subdelegado could actually supervise elections of cabildos and other things. But even though these reforms were going on, caciques more or less at this point still were able to retain some power. So there was this new system of elections that were brought in, which is the terna, right? 3 names that cabildo would give. These are the 3 people that we want. One of them should be our cacique. And this was the government had said, okay, you have to give us 3 names and we'll pick who we think is suitable. But what you find if you go through the documents is that invariably, and there's not one case that I think anybody has found, where the first person named was always the one chosen by the government. And this is because even though there was this fiction of colonial administration still that the government would choose the cacique, in effect there was a tacit agreement between the community and the state that we'll give you 3 names, but the community would really want number 1. And we'll put that person as number 1, and the government would always reciprocate. They would always pick the number 1 person in that list to be the cacique. And so you see that even though these reforms are taking place, in some ways caciques continue to have, and cabildos continue to have certain advantages. Now, early national period is, and this I think is true for a lot of other countries, Guatemala as well, which is this period of steady decline of power of caciques and of indigenous people in general. And by 1824 or so, you see the caciques are become just tax collectors. By 1869, repúblicas of indígenas and cabildos are completely abolished. Now, how did this happen? So, one of the really interesting parts of 19th century is this idea of liberalism. And the liberal ideology was something that spanned not just Yucatan or Guatemala, but also a lot of other places in Latin America. And the idea was that, the fundamental idea was that people should be equal, right? But it also meant that indigenous people would no longer have their particular corporate privileges. So indigenous people before their communities had their own particular powers and privileges. They could have their own customary laws. Now with liberalism coming in, that goes out of the window. You can no longer have corporate privileges. And since caciques, their power was tied into these corporate privileges of these cabildos and these repúblicas, obviously you see a decline of this power. And this is not just something at an ideological level, but it had a really big economic aspect to it, which is that the 19th century, this is true in many other places, for Guatemala it was the coffee boom. And what happens is that you start having commercial plantations, haciendas. And for that you need labor. And as long as indigenous people have their own particular privileges and they can have their own particular land, it's really difficult to get the labor to work on these lands. And so one of the, sort of on the back of liberal ideology was this other economic aspect to sort of, disempower indigenous people a little bit so that they could now be recruited into this new workforce. And so this history of 19th century has been seen, and this is true even in the Andes. There's a historian Brooke Larson who looks at the Andean region in the 19th century, and she also talks about this, this kind of decline you start seeing of indigenous power, prestige, and of caciques in general. And this is the story that historians really mostly talk about. Now, what I try to do is a little bit different, which is that what I try to talk about is that this is not just a story of failure. That the 19th century was not simply a time of decline of status. Yes, it was. Officially, cacique status did decline. Officially, indigenous people did have lesser and lesser privileges. But that there were ways in which people tried to get back the power that they had lost. And for caciques, this meant taking advantage of these very people that the government had put in, these local officials, and engaging in strategic alliances with them to become powerful at the local level. And so if you look at things from a local level, from a cacique perspective, from their individual life stories, you can actually tell a story that's a little bit different from the usual story of decline. You can tell a story of survival, basically. And the method I follow is microhistory. Microhistory is this idea of asking very big questions in very small spaces. So you look at particular towns, villages, not at the very big level of what was happening in Yucatan or Latin America, but what was happening in this town. What were the caciques in this particular town doing? And for me, that was the method I followed, which is microhistory. I looked at small pueblos in Yucatan, and I tried to see what were the lives of the caciques within those towns, and try to piece together their lives. And I did that using these sorts of sources, judicial records, correspondence, documents on land and labor. There's actually a ton of documents in the archive that you can look at. And there are also these particular abusos de autoridad cases, which is abuse of authority cases. And this is again very interesting because you always had transgressions. People always did things that were abusive, but it was only under liberalism that it became a word that was used, and suddenly cases which were just previously habitual transgressions would now be abusos de autoridad cases. And so you have in the 19th century a really plethora of abusos de autoridad cases which you can really mine and look at, and those were really great sources for the work. Okay, so to contextualize things a little bit, to talk about how, what context in which caciques try to survive, try to manipulate things for their advantage. One thing to think about is this idea of municipalization. So we talked about cabildos, indigenous cabildos, and indigenous government. And what you find in the 19th century, especially the Constitution of Cadiz in 1812, it's one of the first sort of liberal constitutions that were made by Spain. And what it did is that it established something called ayuntamientos. Ayuntamientos are town councils. And these were put in every pueblo. And theoretically, they were supposed to be in pueblos with over 1,000 people, but in practice, they were in pueblos everywhere. And the Constitution aimed to provide sort of equality, but in practice, most of the people elected to work in the ayuntamientos were really non-indigenous people, because there was a literacy test, and most Mayan people were not literate in Spanish. So even though ayuntamientos purportedly was this equal council, in practice, most of the people working there and people in power were non-indigenous people. And the two most important of those figures were the alcaldes and the jueces de paz. And these were figures who did all the things that the cacique used to do, and now they became sort of the people with the power. They could do policing, they could try petty cases of justice, public works, everything now came into their ambit. So you have by 1812, Republic is abolished, 1824, they are actually brought back in. And now this is another very interesting part of this whole thing, which is that, yes, the Republicas were abolished for a bit, right? And then the government starts seeing that there are real problems with this. And the problem really always comes back to the money part, which is that taxes have to be still collected. And surprisingly, caciques were far more efficient tax collectors than the alcaldes or jueces de paz or any of these people. And there are two reasons for this. One is that indigenous people trusted their cacique. The cacique knew the lay of the land. He knew everybody there. It was easier for him to collect the taxes. And secondly, and I don't know the explanation for this, but caciques were significantly less corrupt than the jueces de paz and alcaldes. And again, it's probably because the jueces de paz alcaldes didn't have really high salaries, so maybe that's why. But in any case, to get efficient tax collection, you suddenly needed these caciques again. So what do? So 1824, there's a declaration that says that for the collection of the established taxes and only for this objective, respecting the indígenas, the old repúblicas de indios shall be re-established. So they're brought back in as now tax collectors. And the 1825, there's a constitution which now talks about this dual government where the repúblicas now coexist with the ayuntamientos. And obviously you can see the problems with this, which is that suddenly the caciques are not the sole authorities, but they have to share space with these other authority figures like alcaldes or jueces. And suddenly the local politics becomes really, really complex. Because now you not just have one kind of authority, but you have several competing authorities, and that's not even taking into the equation religious authorities or police authorities. So not even talking about curas or not even talking about constables or anything, just government officials. And that was the complexity that you suddenly entered into. And so again, like I said, I do microhistory. So the two cases I found which are really interesting because they give you a sense of how things kind of change over time a little bit. And this one case, this is again obviously the map of Yucatan, this is the Izamal. And this one case of a cacique of Izamal and Francisco Chi. And so what this case is interesting because here you have this one indígena, this guy Rafael Chan, and he comes to the governor and says that, okay, I have been flogged by my cacique and my wife. She's been flogged, 12 lashes myself and 5 whippings from my wife. And suddenly this case opens up, why did this happen? And so what we find is that this person, Rafael Chan, had actually gone to his father's house, Sebastian Chan, and he had beaten up his father. And what the father did is that he came not to the alcalde, he came to the cacique. And he said, my son has beaten me up, now I want justice. The cacique doesn't go to anybody. He said, okay, now these people have to be flogged. And what this shows is that even in as late as 1825, you still have the cacique acting like a bata, acting like a village headman whose job is to uphold communal values. And here a son has beaten his father and he's in his right to administer justice, right? And this is interesting because first of all, you see that he's still seen as a really important authority figure. The man doesn't go to any other official, he goes to the cacique, and the cacique takes matters into his own hand. There is a contrasting case here in this other place called Sotuta. And here, again, this is about communal values, about justice, but a little bit different. And here what happens, you have this one case of this widow called Alejandra Eck, and she complains that the subdelegado of the partido has taken her son and taken the son away from her. And now again, this case opens up. Why did this happen? And what we learned from the testimony of the subdelegado is that it was not him. The cacique had come to the subdelegado and he said to the subdelegado, look, there's this woman who's living a life of dishonor, and honor is a really important thing for in this period. And she's living, she's in the nude in the streets, and she doesn't look after her son. You have to do something about it. And so then the subdelegado orders this child to be taken from the mother and sent to a more honorable house. Now, this is interesting because unlike the previous case where the cacique actually has the power to administer justice, you see in the second case, he no longer just goes and says, this person has to be taken or he has to be flogged. No. Now he is so dependent, he has to go to the subdelegado to even settle small matters that he would have previously settled by himself. Now everything goes to the government official. And you can see sort of this dependence on government officials and local officials throughout this period, in all the documents, which is this feeling that to get anything done, you can't do it yourself anymore, you don't have the power. The power rests with the official, the local official, government official, and you have to go to them. So obviously there's a question that arises, is that does this show increase of power or decrease of power? Because suddenly you have the cacique able to tell the subdelegado and working with him in many ways. So you see this alliance beginning to build up, but you also see this supreme restriction of the cacique really not being able to do anything on his own anymore, and being for everything having to go back to the local officials. And actually, document after document kind of returns this same picture. But what I also do is talk about how this also causes politicization, right? And how incursion of these local officials also opens a window or an opportunity where caciques now can start making alliances. And this is, I'll talk about 3 caciques just today because there's too many caciques and not much time. And the 3 caciques I'll talk about are all from the same region of Valladolid. And it's Peto, Macedonio Sul of Peto, Proposio Cocom of Tepic, and Mauricio Machochen. So to the first one. And this is the case of Macedonio Sul. And so in December 1829, Macedonio Sul, who is an ex-cacique of Peto, he's been deposed from his post. He petitions the government and he says, you know, I need to get my post back because I never resigned because I wanted to. I resigned because there was a lot of pressure on me from the subdelegado, Antonio Gutierrez, and so that's why I resigned, and now you have to give me back my post. And actually this is kind of a happy story sometimes. He actually gets back the post. But things don't really turn out so well for him after all, because again, in 1836, you have another petition from him, which saying that, okay, now the new subdelegado and the new juez are coming, and milpa is like the cornfield, right? Corn is really important, and growing it is really important. So, subdelegado and juez, they are coming into these areas and seizing the grains, and seizing all of my stuff, and so he complains. But this time, fortunately, he does not resign. Now, this is actually not just a story of this cacique being a victim, because over the course of the 1830s and 40s, and really in this president really talking about that particular period in the 1820s and 40s, you see that this person actually becomes a pretty powerful figure in the locality. And so you have, for instance, he becomes a Mayan signature to a plebiscite. He's, you know, he's in town hall signing election results. And the reason why he becomes quite powerful is that he forms his own alliance. So you have this, you know, local government official, an alcalde, who's, you know, Cornelio Souza, who's the alcalde of this town. And what Zul does is that he forges an alliance with this Cornelio Souza. And they become kind of like the power couple of Peto. And what also happens is that people start fearing them. They fear that these two are going to manipulate elections, that they are going to force the peasant to vote in particular ways. So you have this sudden sense that alliance with this man suddenly makes Sul what he was never before. He becomes powerful. And not only powerful, he actually becomes really, really wealthy. By the late 1840s, 1850s, Sul is one of the most wealthy people in the town of Peto. So here you have this story, which I think is part of this broader theme I'm talking about, which is of the increasing politicization of caciques in this period, and how, you know, on the one hand, if you cross roads with the subdelegado and you're not so good relation with him, you could be ousted from power. The same token, if you had really good relations with particular officials, you could become powerful. And so again, this idea of politicization becomes another way of trying to figure out how could caciques remain powerful despite working within the system. So one case of this Sul, which talks about how you have this alliance, and also there's a flip side to this, which is that what happens when a cacique becomes so powerful that he doesn't have to care about the indigenous community at all. And this is the case of Cocom. And for Cocom, this is another very interesting case. He becomes so powerful that he's known for abusing his own people. So you have a lot of petitions from villagers in his town saying that Cocom has been, imprisoning villagers, whipping them, shackling them up. And whenever these villagers try to go to their alcalde to get some justice, the alcalde sends them back to the cacique. So they never get any justice because they're all in cahoots. So this alcalde peon becomes a really important ally of this cacique. And he basically becomes, one of the reasons why Cocom is able to become so powerful. Not only that, Cocom is able to tap into the civil soldiers in the area, and he's able to even use the soldiers at his disposal. So here you have one case of what happens when a cacique becomes so powerful because of alliance with political authority figures that he can now transgress even the expected conduct within his own community. And this is actually probably the reason why. There's several petitions by the villagers of this town, but it takes about more than 2 years before Kokon is actually asked to resign his post. But he's able to hold on to his power for a very long time. Now, to these two cases, at the end, I'm just going to present a counter case. And this is the case of Mauricio Mai of Shochen. And this is a little bit different. During his tenure as a cacique, Mai was subject to a lot of humiliation by the alcaldes of the town. And on one occasion, he was even imprisoned and shackled for 8 days. And Mai presented a threat to the established authorities of the town. So what happened is that he was suspended from his post as cacique, so he was no longer a cacique after 1839. But you see petitions from him even in 1841. And what you find is that despite the fact that he was officially no longer a cacique, he never thought of himself as an ex-cacique. When he presented his petitions to the governor, and he does so in 1841, he takes the complaints of his villagers and he goes to the governor and he says, I'm the cabeza of my town, I'm the head of my town. And you can see that there are testimonies of villagers also who are supporting him and in his, in his expedition. And so you see that it is legitimacy in the eyes of the community rather than the government, which makes Mai so very, very powerful. And so this is a kind of contrasting thing, because here also Mauricio Mai's story is a story of politicization, but it is not a politicization like that of Sulen Kokom. So Sulen Kokom's politicization was through alliance making with local government officials. And it's quite likely that once they stop being a cacique, they would not become such important allies to these people. Sul's case is a little bit different. Here, the politicization actually happens as a rejection of government officials altogether. And so you see now this is a kind of politicization which uses the community as the way of becoming political. And it's something that, and I won't talk about it here, but later on there is something called the caste war in Yucatan, which is a racial war in many ways. And a lot of caciques actually do what Mai does, which is try to defend their community against the Spanish. And so this is the kind of politicization which actually becomes quite important later. So just in a conclusion, so we see that in the 1820s, 40s, and this kind of this 20-30 year period I'm talking about here, caciques are reduced to being nothing more than tax collectors in the eyes of the government, and formally their power is really, really declining. But you also see that parallel process of intensifying politicization. And document after document returns the same story of politicization, and of caciques actually becoming quite powerful in certain cases. So this is actually not a story of failure, but a story of cunning, of manipulation, and of opportunities, and how caciques are able to actually to use them, and obviously in the context of these things. So there's some implications, I think, to this that are important to kind of just think about. You always have the so what question. So I talked about caciques, so what? And there are some bigger issues here that are important to think about. And one is that caciques have often been seen as just intermediaries, as sort of conduits between two worlds. And what you see here is caciques as really political figures, and that they were never really conduits or intermediaries in the sense of being apolitical, but were very vested in the kind of mediation that they were doing. Second, and I think this is relevant to a lot of things, which is that how do people who have been excluded from the process of governance, how do they insert themselves back into those processes? How do they have a say in it? And what I think this case shows is that sometimes, if you look at the local level, you can see alliances formed at the local level, which help you understand how this takes place. That people can become powerful by looking at the local political politics, and that's how they can also insert themselves into governance and other things. And I think finally, and this I think even bigger thing, which is this bigger story of Mayan struggle for survival and empowerment. There's a really great autobiography by Rigoberta Menchú, Guatemala, and this is a story of a Mayan woman who survived in the 1980s in Guatemala, and it's a story of how Mayans tried to survive a lot of things like, ethnic sort of racializing and other things. And there are other instances too today. I don't know, in 1994, many of you know about the Zapatista uprising, which was in the Lacandon forest in Chiapas. Again, this is a Mayan uprising in response to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And again, this is again one of those moments where you see Mayan people really trying to get back their land, get back their sort of customary privilege, and this idea of trying to survive and struggle to get power is something that's a bigger Mayan story, which I think continues even to this day. And so my story of cacique is I think relevant because it's part of that bigger story. It's not just about the 19th century. It's about struggle for survival and empowerment as a Mayan. Finally, I just want to acknowledge, really thankful to the Guatemalan embassy for putting up this exhibit and having us all here. Instituto Cervantes, and I think Jesús has been very nice about working with my schedule and things. So I'm really thankful that we could do this. And on a personal note, I actually I lost my grandmother a few days ago, and she was one of those people who really taught me the importance of a life story. I just listened to her stories growing up, and from her I could figure out that okay, one individual life can shed so much light on bigger historical questions. So it's also sort of a tribute to my grandmother, and thank you so much for